The Banda Islands entered the 17th century already surrounded, though the horizon still looked open to those who lived there. Small volcanic islands rose sharply from the Banda Sea, their slopes thick with nutmeg trees whose fruit carried a scent known across continents. Ships had been arriving for generations, anchored offshore with holds empty and departing heavy with spice. Arab traders, Javanese merchants, Chinese crews, Portuguese adventurers, and English captains all came and went, bringing cloth, metal, silver, and stories of distant wars. The Bandanese had learned to live with the sea crowded by foreign sails, yet they had never known a moment like this, when ships no longer arrived to bargain but to remain, when anchors dropped not in patience but in warning. By the second decade of the 17th century, the waters around Banda filled with vessels that did not leave. Their crews built forts, stockpiled weapons, and spoke openly of exclusivity. Trade routes that had once been fluid hardened into lines of control. Nutmeg, once a product exchanged through negotiation, became the justification for confinement. The islands were no longer merely valuable, they were intolerably independent. The presence of the Dutch East India Company turned the Banda Sea into a closed space, watched, patrolled, and measured not by custom, but by contracts backed with force. For the people of Banda, danger did not announce itself with a single blow. It arrived gradually, as options narrowed. Villages still harvested nutmeg, still dried it in the sun, still carried it down to waiting boats. Yet the number of buyers shrank. Dutch officials insisted on agreements that bound future harvests to a single purchaser at prices set far from the islands. When Bandanese leaders resisted, negotiations stalled, and ships remained offshore longer than before. Guns were moved into view. Forts grew stone by stone along the coast. The sea, once a source of opportunity, began to feel like a wall. The first real shock came with isolation. English traders, once welcomed, were driven away through naval pressure and intimidation. Other Asian merchants were warned off or seized. What had been an open market collapsed into enforced silence. The Bandanese could no longer balance one foreign power against another. The strategy that had preserved their autonomy for generations failed under a new logic that did not recognize reciprocity. Trade had become monopoly, and monopoly demanded submission or removal. This transformation unfolded not as an abstract economic shift, but as a daily tightening of life. Nutmeg orchards were watched, boats were searched, movement between islands became dangerous. Leaders who had once mediated disputes through custom now found themselves summoned to meetings where unfamiliar legal language carried threats they could feel but not fully decode. European contracts, presented as binding and permanent, clashed with Bandanese expectations of negotiated obligation. When terms were broken, punishment followed swiftly and unevenly. Violence ceased to be incidental and became instructional. The sense of impending collapse spread unevenly. Some believed accommodation might preserve life and land, that limited concessions could avert disaster. Others argued that submission would only invite further demands. These disagreements fractured communities already under strain. The islands were small, their populations tightly connected through kinship and trade, yet fear began to isolate families and villages from one another. Decisions made in one place rippled outward, affecting everyone who depended on shared access to sea lanes and harvest cycles. Above all, uncertainty dominated. The Bandanese could not see the full shape of what confronted them. They did not know that decisions were being debated in distant boardrooms, that shareholders in Europe measured their islands in profit margins, or that a corporate charter granted foreigners the authority to wage war in pursuit of spice. What they knew was immediate. Armed men were arriving with increasing frequency, insisting on obedience backed by cannon. The future, once open-ended, now felt predetermined by forces beyond negotiation. The Dutch presence carried a different weight than earlier visitors. These men did not come as individual traders seeking advantage. They arrived as representatives of an organization that fused commerce with sovereignty. Their ships were warships as much as merchants. Their officers spoke of law and order while preparing for violence. Their settlements were not temporary, but intended to endure, reshaping the islands around them. The Bandanese sensed, even without full understanding, that this was not another phase of trade, but a fundamental threat to their way of life. Rumors spread quickly across the islands, stories of executions, of villages burned elsewhere, of resistance crushed with exemplary cruelty. Some accounts were exaggerated, others understated, but all carried the same message. Refusal now carried fatal consequences. The sea lanes that had once carried opportunity now carried warning. Every sail on the horizon provoked anxiety rather than anticipation. The physical geography of Banda intensified this fear. The islands offered little room to retreat. Steep slopes, narrow coastlines, and limited arable land meant that blockade translated quickly into hunger. Control of the sea equaled control of survival. The Dutch understood this, positioning their ships to cut off movement and supplies. What might have been a negotiable dispute in a larger territory became existential in a confined archipelago. There was nowhere to disappear. For ordinary people, the crisis manifested in small, relentless ways. Fishing trips shortened. Harvests were hidden or delayed. Families debated whether to flee to neighboring islands, knowing that escape might bring safety or expose them to pursuit. Every decision carried risk. Even silence could be interpreted as defiance. The rhythm of daily life, once aligned with seasons and tides, was now governed by the presence of foreign patrols. This was not yet massacre, but it was already collapse in slow motion. The foundations that had sustained Banda's independence, open trade, diplomatic balance, and control over its own resources were being stripped away systematically. Violence loomed not as a possibility, but as a conclusion toward which events were moving. The islands were being prepared for transformation through force, whether their inhabitants submitted or not. The Dutch did not hide their intentions for long. Monopoly required certainty, and certainty required control over both land and people. Resistance, however limited, was interpreted as justification for escalation. Each act of defiance, each refusal to accept imposed terms, reinforced the conviction that Banda could not be managed through negotiation alone. In the logic now governing the islands, coexistence had failed. As ships gathered and fortifications expanded, the Bandanese stood at the edge of a future they could not yet fully see, but already feared. The sea was closed, trade was constrained, and authority had shifted beyond their reach. What had once been a crossroads of the world was becoming a trap, its value transformed into a sentence. The crisis was no longer approaching. It had arrived, settled into the harbors, and waited patiently for the moment when force would replace all remaining words. Long before foreign flags fixed the Banda Islands within a single, narrowing fate, life there unfolded according to rhythms shaped by sea, soil, and exchange rather than coercion. The islands were small, but they were not isolated. Their steep volcanic slopes produced nutmeg and mace, commodities rare enough to draw traders from across the Indian Ocean world. Yet the Bandanese never understood this rarity as a license for domination. It was instead the basis of balance. Ships arrived because Banda welcomed them, and ships returned because terms were negotiated rather than imposed. Bandanese society before European monopoly was decentralized and resilient. Power did not rest in a single ruler or court, but was distributed among village leaders and merchant families who controlled access to orchards, harbors, and labor. Decisions were shaped through consultation, alliances, and customary law rather than decree. This diffusion of authority frustrated later European observers who searched in vain for a king whose submission might deliver the islands wholesale. What they encountered instead was a network, flexible and difficult to coerce, built for negotiation rather than obedience. Trade defined daily life, but not as abstraction. Nutmeg harvesting required careful timing, collective labor, and intimate knowledge of the trees that clung to Banda's hillsides. Families tended groves over generations, understanding which slopes yielded the best fruit and which winds carried storms that could ruin a season's work. Once harvested, nutmeg was dried, sorted, and stored before being carried down to the shore, where foreign merchants waited. These exchanges were social as much as economic, marked by conversation, gift-giving, and the slow building of trust. Prices shifted with supply and demand, but they were never fixed by threat. The Bandanese understood the dangers of dependence. They had learned, through centuries of contact, that no single trading partner should ever dominate. Portuguese ships had come early, followed by others, but none were allowed exclusive rights. English and Dutch traders, when they first arrived, were treated as additional participants in an already crowded marketplace. Competition among buyers worked to Banda's advantage, keeping prices high and political leverage dispersed. This was not naivety, it was strategy refined through experience. Foreign merchants often misread this openness as weakness. They saw a lack of fortifications and assumed vulnerability, mistaking hospitality for submission. In reality, Banda's defense lay in its relationships. A trader who offended local norms could be excluded, delayed, or undercut by rivals. The sea, wide and interconnected, offered alternatives. Power flowed outward rather than downward, sustained by mobility rather than walls. For generations this system held. Social life reflected the same openness. The islands hosted people from across Asia, some temporary, others permanent. Languages mixed along the shoreline. Marriages, partnerships, and shared ventures tied Banda to distant ports. Islam had taken root through trade rather than conquest, blending with existing customs rather than erasing them. Identity was layered, flexible, and outward-looking. Banda was not a frontier waiting to be claimed, but a hub actively shaping its own place in the world. This autonomy extended to conflict resolution. Disputes over trade or conduct were addressed through negotiation, compensation, or exclusion, rarely through sustained violence. The memory of past clashes informed caution, but escalation was avoided whenever possible. Survival depended on continuity, on keeping the flow of goods and people moving. War disrupted harvests, frightened traders away, and threatened the fragile equilibrium that sustained the islands. Peace, even when tense, was always preferable. The arrival of European joint stock companies introduced a logic alien to this system, where the Bandanese saw trade as a relationship renewed with each season. These newcomers spoke of permanent rights and exclusive contracts. Where Banda relied on plurality to maintain leverage, the companies demanded singular loyalty. The gap between these worldviews widened with each encounter, yet at first it remained bridgeable. Early agreements were interpreted differently on each side, signed with expectations that would soon collide. For the Bandanese, a contract was contingent, bound to circumstance and renegotiation. For the Dutch, it was absolute, enforceable across time through violence, if necessary. This divergence did not immediately produce catastrophe, but it seeded misunderstanding at every level. When Bandanese traders sold nutmeg to non-Dutch buyers after signing agreements, they believed they were exercising established rights. When the Dutch responded with force, they believed they were enforcing law. Each side acted consistently within its own framework, yet the consequences fell disproportionately on the islands. Daily life began to absorb these tensions. Meetings reflected strain rather than routine. Dutch ships lingered longer, their officers less patient, their demands more specific. Bandanese leaders faced choices that had no precedent in their experience. Concession risked the collapse of independence. Resistance risked immediate retaliation. The old tools of balance, delay, negotiation, diversification lost effectiveness against a partner unwilling to accept limits. Still, many believed coexistence was possible. The memory of earlier foreigners who had come and gone fostered hope that this too might pass. The islands had endured storms, droughts, and outbreaks of disease. They had adapted before. Few yet imagined that trade itself would become the instrument of destruction, that nutmeg, the source of their prosperity, would justify their erasure. As the Dutch presence hardened, Banda's pre-existing world did not vanish overnight. It persisted stubbornly, even defiantly, in habits and expectations shaped by generations of autonomy. That persistence, however, now carried risk. What had once preserved independence was becoming grounds for punishment. The very system that had sustained Banda's openness made it incapable of satisfying a power that demanded exclusivity. By the time violence loomed openly, the Bandanese were defending more than land or profit. They were defending a way of living that assumed negotiation over domination and plurality over monopoly. The clash that approached was not simply between armed men and unarmed villagers, but between two incompatible visions of how the world should be organized. One had thrived quietly for centuries. The other arrived convinced that endurance without submission was unacceptable. The islands stood on the brink of that collision, still rooted in habits of independence, even as the forces gathering around them prepared to erase the conditions that made such habits possible. The balance that had once protected Banda now exposed it, and the transition from trade to conquest moved steadily closer, driven not by misunderstanding alone, but by an economic system that could tolerate no alternative. The Dutch East India Company did not arrive in the Banda Islands as an accident of exploration or the ambition of a single captain. It arrived as the physical expression of a new structure of power, one that fused private investment, state authority, and organized violence into a single mechanism. By the time its ships appeared regularly in Bandanese waters, the decision that Banda must be controlled had already been made far away, in counting houses and council chambers, where nutmeg existed not as a harvest or a livelihood, but as a line of profit vulnerable to competition. The VOC was created at the beginning of the 17th century to solve a problem the Dutch Republic could not manage through individual traders alone. Competition among Dutch merchants in Asia had driven prices down and profits with them. Worse, it weakened the Republic's position against Iberian rivals who already treated trade as an extension of imperial warfare. The solution was consolidation. The States General granted the VOC extraordinary powers, the right to wage war, build forts, negotiate treaties, administer justice, and govern territory in the name of commerce. What emerged was not simply a company, but a sovereign actor whose survival depended on eliminating uncertainty. Within this framework, Banda was intolerable as it existed. The islands were too small to absorb price fluctuations, too valuable to leave open, and too independent to be reliable. As long as nutmeg could be sold to multiple buyers, its price would remain unstable. As long as Bandanese leaders could choose their trading partners, Dutch leverage would remain incomplete. From the perspective of the VOC's directors, Banda represented risk, and risk threatened dividends, reputations, and the political standing of the company itself. This logic translated quickly into policy. VOC agents were instructed not merely to trade, but to secure exclusive contracts, enforce them rigorously, and prevent any leakage of spice to rival powers. English merchants were to be excluded. Asian traders were to be warned off or punished. Local producers were to be bound permanently to the company through agreements framed as lawful and binding, regardless of how they were understood by those who signed them. Monopoly was no longer a goal among others, it was the condition of success. On the ground, this mandate reshaped every interaction. Dutch officials approached Bandanese leaders not as partners, but as subjects who had yet to recognize their obligations. Meetings grew more formal, language more rigid, and patience shorter. Where earlier traders had accepted delays and renegotiation as part of doing business, VOC representatives interpreted the same behaviors as defiance. Each perceived breach of contract hardened attitudes and justified further escalation. The company's power rested not only in its charters, but in its ships. Heavily armed and professionally crewed, they dwarfed the vessels of most competitors and signaled a willingness to use force as a routine instrument of policy. Forts constructed along Banda's coast were not defensive conveniences. They were statements of intent. They asserted permanence, jurisdiction, and the readiness to compel compliance. Their cannons faced inward as much as outward. For the Bandanese, the change was immediate and disorienting. The familiar rhythms of trade were interrupted by inspections, restrictions, and demands for exclusivity that violated established norms. Nutmeg, once exchanged freely among many buyers, became the object of surveillance. Harvests were monitored. Boats were intercepted. The sea itself seemed to shrink under watchful eyes. Autonomy eroded not through proclamation, but through accumulated constraint. Misunderstanding compounded tension. Dutch officials believed they were enforcing clear agreements, signed and sealed according to their legal tradition. Bandanese leaders believed they were engaging in flexible arrangements subject to renegotiation. When Dutch demands hardened into threats, resistance appeared not as rebellion, but as defense of customary rights. Each side saw the other as acting in bad faith, yet only one possessed the means to impose its interpretation by force. Inside the VOC, these conflicts reinforced a growing conviction that Banda could not be managed through commerce alone. Reports sent back to Batavia and the Netherlands described uncooperative producers, broken contracts, and persistent foreign interference. These accounts framed violence not as aggression, but as necessity, a regrettable but unavoidable step to secure order. The language of administration softened the reality of what was being prepared. The company's internal pressures intensified this trajectory. Investors demanded returns. Rivals threatened to undermine prices. Failure in Banda would signal weakness across Asia, encouraging defiance elsewhere. The islands became symbolic, a test case for whether the VOC-AS hybrid model of corporate sovereignty could impose itself on distant societies. Success would validate the system. Failure would expose its limits. For ordinary Dutch sailors and soldiers, this translated into orders that framed Banda as hostile territory. They were told of treachery, of agreements dishonored, of natives who refused lawful authority. Fear and resentment grew alongside discipline. Violence became easier to imagine even before it was enacted. The distance between policy and action narrowed as men accustomed to naval warfare prepared for land operations among people they no longer recognized as trading partners. Meanwhile, Bandanese communities absorbed the consequences without access to the debates that shaped them. They experienced policy as pressure and violence as sudden, localized shock. Decisions made in distant offices manifested as blockades that cut off food, as arrests that removed leaders, as punishments that escalated without warning. The logic driving these actions remained invisible, but its effects were unmistakable. By insisting on monopoly, the VOC had committed itself to transformation rather than coexistence. There was no stable compromise between Banda, say, decentralized autonomy, and the company, say, demand for exclusive control. Each concession demanded another. Each act of resistance justified harsher enforcement. The system could not pause, because pause invited competition and threatened profit. As the company's resolve hardened, Banda's fate narrowed. What began as commercial friction evolved into an existential conflict driven by incompatible structures of power. The islands were no longer negotiating their place in a trading network. They were being assessed for their utility within an empire of commerce. The next step was no longer a matter of contracts, but of coercion on a scale that would permanently alter the human landscape of the Banda Sea. The treaties that bound the Banda Islands to the Dutch East India Company did not emerge from mutual understanding, nor were they the product of balanced negotiation. They were written documents carried ashore by armed men, presented in circumstances where refusal already carried consequences. Ink followed intimidation, and signatures were obtained in the shadow of ships whose cannons remained visible reminders of what enforcement meant in practice. To the Dutch officials who drafted these agreements, the process appeared orderly. They recorded dates, names, and terms with meticulous care, framing each treaty as a lawful transfer of rights. Exclusive purchasing clauses were spelled out. Penalties for violation were enumerated. Sovereignty over trade was redefined as obedience to a single buyer. In Dutch records, Banda became a place of contracts repeatedly broken, its leaders unreliable and deserving of punishment. On paper, everything was clear. On the islands, clarity was an illusion. Bandanese leaders approached these meetings with assumptions shaped by centuries of trade, conducted through flexible arrangements. Agreements were understood as situational, bound to current conditions and subject to renegotiation if circumstances changed. No document, however formal, could permanently alienate communal rights to land or harvest. Authority to sign did not equate to authority to bind future generations. What the Dutch regarded as permanent surrender was, to the Bandanese, a temporary accommodation under duress. The imbalance of power distorted every exchange. Dutch ships controlled access to sea lanes and food supplies. Forts overlooked harbors where nutmeg was loaded. Soldiers accompanied negotiators, their presence deliberate and unmistakable. Refusal did not mean continued bargaining. It meant blockade, arrest, or worse. Acceptance, even when given, carried the unspoken understanding that survival required compliance, at least for the moment. Misinterpretation was not accidental. The VOC relied on European legal forms precisely because they could be enforced unilaterally. Contracts transformed violence into administration. When Bandanese traders later sold nutmeg to English or Asian merchants, the Dutch framed these acts as breaches of law rather than expressions of autonomy. Punishment followed not as retaliation, but as correction. Violence acquired the language of legality. These treaties fractured Banda internally. Leaders who signed were accused by others of surrendering communal rights without consent. Those who refused were blamed for provoking Dutch aggression. Villages argued over strategy as pressure intensified. Unity, once sustained through shared interest in open trade, began to erode under the strain of imposed exclusivity. The Dutch exploited these divisions, recognizing that fragmented resistance was easier to manage than collective defiance. For ordinary people, the effects were immediate and personal. Nutmeg harvests that had once flowed through diverse channels were now seized or rejected if they did not meet VOC terms. Traders found themselves accused of smuggling for continuing long-established relationships. Punishments were uneven and unpredictable, reinforcing fear. The rules seemed to change without warning, yet always to the company's advantage. Trust collapsed alongside trade. Dutch enforcement hardened quickly. Fort commanders demanded adherence not only to written clauses, but to the spirit of monopoly, interpreted broadly and enforced harshly. Villages suspected of defiance faced raids, boats were burned, hostages were taken to compel compliance. Each enforcement action produced new grievances, which in turn justified further coercion. The cycle fed on itself, narrowing space for any resolution that did not involve submission. Within VOC correspondence, These developments were framed as necessary discipline. Reports emphasized Bandanese duplicity and resistance, portraying force as a reluctant response to persistent lawlessness. Little attention was paid to the circumstances under which agreements had been obtained, or to the cultural chasm separating the two sides. The narrative that emerged cast Banda as ungovernable, its people incapable of honoring contracts without compulsion. The reality on the islands was one of accelerating insecurity. Leaders summoned to Dutch forts did not know whether they would return. Communities learned to associate negotiation with danger. The act of meeting, once a routine part of trade, became a moment of risk. Silence and avoidance replaced dialogue, further convincing Dutch officials that resistance was entrenched and deceitful. The treaties had accomplished their purpose not by stabilizing relations, but by redefining resistance as criminality. Once, autonomy was recast as breach of contract. Violence could be justified indefinitely. There was no longer a neutral ground from which the Bandanese could assert their customs. Every action outside VOC control became evidence of rebellion. This legal transformation mattered because it removed limits. If Banda was lawless, then extraordinary measures were permissible. If treaties had been broken, then collective punishment could be framed as restoration of order. The step from enforcement to annihilation shortened dramatically. What began as commerce backed by arms evolved into governance backed by terror. For the Bandanese, the meaning of these documents became painfully clear only over time. Agreements did not constrain Dutch behavior. They constrained Bandanese survival. Each signature closed off alternatives. Each concession invited new demands. The hope that accommodation might preserve life lingered, but it thinned with every execution, every burned boat, every vanished leader. By the time resistance hardened into defiance, the ground had already shifted. The treaties had done their work. They had stripped Banda of legitimacy in the eyes of the VOC and prepared the moral and legal terrain for violence on a scale far beyond contract enforcement. The language of law now pointed toward eradication, not negotiation. As Dutch ships continued to gather and authority consolidated under increasingly militant leadership, the Banda Islands moved from coercion toward catastrophe. The documents signed under threat had not resolved conflict, they had structured it. What lay ahead would no longer be framed as dispute over trade, but as punishment for disobedience, carried out with a certainty born from paper agreements written far from the lives they were about to destroy. Resistance in the Banda Islands did not erupt suddenly, nor did it take the form of a single, unified rebellion. It emerged unevenly, shaped by desperation, memory, and the slow realization that accommodation was no longer buying safety. Acts that had once been ordinary expressions of autonomy were now treated as crimes, and it was through these small, cumulative refusals that defiance took shape. Nutmeg continued to be sold to non-Dutch traders. Boats continued to slip between islands under cover of night. Leaders delayed meetings, evaded summons, or spoke in careful ambiguities rather than surrender outright. These actions were not declarations of war, but attempts to survive within a system that had turned hostile. For the VOC, however, intent mattered less than outcome. Any nutmeg that escaped Dutch control represented lost profit and a challenge to authority. Each successful exchange with English or Asian merchants threatened to unravel the monopoly the company was determined to impose. What the Bandanese saw as continuity, the Dutch interpreted as provocation. The gap between perception and response widened rapidly, and patience evaporated. The first blood was shed not in a climactic battle, but in targeted reprisals. Dutch patrols seized boats suspected of smuggling and executed their crews as warnings. Villages accused of defiance were raided, their food stores confiscated, their leaders arrested. These punishments were meant to be exemplary, calibrated to instill fear without provoking widespread revolt. Instead, they hardened resolve. Violence stripped away any remaining belief that compliance would be rewarded with restraint. Bandanese resistance took on sharper edges. Some communities attacked isolated Dutch outposts and killed small groups of soldiers. These actions were localized and often improvised, driven by immediate grievances rather than coordinated strategy. The island's geography, with its narrow channels and dense vegetation, favored ambush and escape, but it also limited the scale of sustained resistance. Every attack carried risk, yet inaction now carried certainty of loss. Violence became, for some, the only remaining language that had not yet been fully claimed by the Dutch. The killing of Dutch personnel marked a turning point. What had been framed as enforcement of contracts was now recast as suppression of rebellion. VOC officials seized upon these incidents as proof that Banda was irredeemably hostile. Reports sent to Batavia emphasized danger and betrayal, portraying the islands as a threat to Dutch lives and honor. The narrative shifted decisively. Banda was no longer merely uncooperative, it was dangerous. For the Bandanese, the consequences were immediate and severe. Retaliation followed swiftly. Dutch forces destroyed villages suspected of involvement, regardless of evidence. Collective punishment replaced targeted enforcement. The distinction between combatant and civilian collapsed under the weight of reprisal. Fear spread faster than resistance ever had. Families fled into the interior or attempted to escape by sea, only to find routes blocked or watched. The social fabric of the island strained under the pressure. Communities argued over responsibility for provoking Dutch wrath. Those who had urged caution accused resistors of inviting annihilation. Those who resisted accused moderates of enabling oppression. These divisions were painful and intimate, cutting through kinship ties and shared histories. The Dutch, observing this fragmentation, recognized its utility. A divided Banda was easier to dominate. English traders, still present intermittently, became both allies and liabilities. Their willingness to buy nutmeg sustained Bandanese resistance economically, yet their presence further antagonized the VOC. Skirmishes between English and Dutch forces in the region heightened tension, turning Banda into a proxy battlefield within a broader imperial rivalry. The island's inhabitants were trapped between powers whose conflicts dwarfed their own capacity to influence outcomes. As violence escalated, Dutch enforcement lost any pretense of proportionality. Executions were staged publicly, bodies were displayed as warnings. The intention was no longer to correct behavior, but to reshape it through terror. The message was clear. Resistance would not be negotiated, it would be eradicated. Each punitive act narrowed the Bandanese's remaining options, pushing more people toward desperate choices. Within the VOC hierarchy, these developments were interpreted as confirmation that leniency had failed. Officials argued that half measures only encouraged defiance. Banda, they concluded, required decisive action. The language of correspondence hardened, calling for solutions that would permanently secure the monopoly. Temporary compliance was no longer sufficient. Stability demanded transformation. For ordinary Bandanese, life became a sequence of calculations under threat. Whether to harvest nutmeg at all, whether to hide or sell, whether to flee or stay. Hunger loomed as blockades tightened and fields were abandoned. The familiar markers of seasonal life dissolved into uncertainty. Children grew up amid fear rather than trade, their memories shaped by patrols and punishment instead of visiting ships and open markets. The escalation fed on itself. Each act of resistance justified harsher reprisals, which in turn generated more resistance from those who felt they had nothing left to lose. The spiral moved steadily toward extremes. The possibility of coexistence receded with every execution and burned village. Banda's value, once measured in spice, was now calculated in the cost of pacification. By the time Dutch officials began openly discussing the need for overwhelming force, the groundwork had been laid by months of mutual violence and deepening mistrust. Resistance had proven that Banda would not submit quietly. Retaliation had proven that the VOC would not tolerate autonomy. The conflict had crossed a threshold from which it could not easily return. What followed was no longer a matter of restoring order through enforcement. It was a decision about the future composition of the islands themselves. The question confronting the VOC was no longer how to make the Bandanese obey, but whether they were necessary at all. In the logic now prevailing, land mattered more than people and nutmeg more than lives. The stage was set for a response that would not merely suppress resistance, but remove its source entirely. Pieterszoon Coen entered the Banda story not as an unknown commander seeking opportunity, but as a man already convinced that restraint was weakness and compromise a liability. By the time his attention fixed fully on the islands, violence there had ceased to be an unfortunate byproduct of trade disputes and had become, in his mind, the only remaining instrument capable of producing order. Coen did not invent the VOC's monopoly logic, but he embraced it with an intensity that stripped away hesitation and transformed policy into action. Coen's rise within the Dutch East India Company coincided with its most aggressive phase of expansion. He had seen firsthand how competition undermined profits and how hesitation invited defiance. In Asia, he observed local rulers testing Dutch resolve, weighing promises against force. From these experiences, he drew a simple conclusion: authority that was not feared would not endure. Banda, with its persistent resistance and strategic importance, became the place where this belief would be tested and imposed. As Governor-General based in Batavia, Coen viewed the Banda Islands less as communities than as variables in a larger system. Nutmeg was essential to the company's financial health, and Banda's refusal to submit threatened not only revenue, but credibility. If a small archipelago could defy the VOC, others might follow. Control of Banda, therefore, carried significance far beyond its shores. It was a demonstration meant to resonate across Asia. Coen's correspondence reveals a man impatient with negotiation. He dismissed Bandanese leaders as unreliable and saw treaties as tools to be enforced rather than relationships to be maintained. Where others still entertained the possibility of accommodation, Coen argued that coexistence had failed. Banda's people, he believed, would never voluntarily accept monopoly. This conviction hardened into policy. The islands were to be subdued decisively, their resistance broken in a manner that would discourage imitation. Preparation for such action began quietly but methodically. Coen ordered the concentration of forces, drawing soldiers, ships, and supplies toward Banda. He authorized the recruitment of mercenaries and the mobilization of Asian auxiliaries, expanding the company's capacity for sustained land operations. This was not an impulsive response to a single incident, but the culmination of years of frustration translated into deliberate planning. For the Bandanese, Coen's ascent intensified an already precarious situation. Dutch enforcement grew sharper, less responsive to appeal or explanation. Arrests increased, surveillance tightened. The margin for error vanished. Decisions once debated locally were now judged remotely, filtered through reports that emphasized defiance and downplayed provocation. The distance between Banda and Batavia magnified misunderstanding while accelerating punishment. Coen framed his approach as necessity rather than cruelty. In his view, partial measures prolonged instability and increased suffering by allowing resistance to persist. A swift, overwhelming demonstration of force, he believed, would bring lasting peace and secure the monopoly permanently. This logic erased distinctions between leaders and civilians, between resistors and bystanders. Anyone who enabled defiance, directly or indirectly, became part of the problem to be removed. Within the VOC, Coen found support among those who prioritized profit and precedent over restraint. Shareholders expected results. Directors expected control. Banda's ongoing instability threatened both. Coen's willingness to act decisively reassured his superiors that the company's authority would be defended at any cost. His reputation grew accordingly, even as the human consequences of his policies remained abstract to those far removed from the islands. On the ground, fear deepened. Rumors of impending invasion circulated among the Bandanese, carried by traders, captured sailors, and intercepted messages. The knowledge that decisions were now driven by a man who viewed annihilation as acceptable strategy altered calculations. Resistance no longer aimed at negotiation or leverage. It became a matter of survival against an approaching force whose intentions were increasingly clear. Coen's worldview left no room for Banda as it had existed. The decentralized autonomy that had sustained the islands for generations was incompatible with the centralized authority he sought to impose. In his reasoning, the land's value lay in its production, not its people. If the Bandanese could not be made to serve the monopoly, they could be replaced. This conclusion, stark and unyielding, marked a turning point from coercion to extermination. The transformation was not instantaneous. Orders moved through channels, ships assembled, supplies were stockpiled. Each step carried the weight of inevitability. Banda was being prepared for an event that would not merely punish resistance, but reconfigure the islands entirely. The scale of what was coming exceeded anything the Bandanese had yet experienced, though its outlines were already visible in the tightening grip of Dutch authority. As Coen finalized his plans, the language surrounding Banda shifted decisively. It was no longer described as a troublesome trading partner, but as a security threat requiring resolution. The possibility of compromise vanished from official discourse. What remained was a grim certainty that force, once unleashed, would not be limited to restoring order, but would aim to eliminate the conditions under which resistance could ever arise again. The islands waited under gathering pressure, their fate increasingly shaped by a man who believed that terror was not a failure of governance, but its ultimate proof. What had begun as conflict over trade was now poised to become something far more final. The next phase would move beyond preparation and into action, as Coen's convictions were carried across the sea by armed men ready to turn policy into irreversible reality. The decision to destroy Banda as a functioning, independent society was not executed in haste. It unfolded through preparation that was deliberate, methodical, and chilling in its clarity. Once Pieterszoon Coen concluded that coexistence was impossible, the remaining task was logistical. Violence on the scale he envisioned required planning, resources, and coordination that only the full machinery of the VOC could provide. What followed was not a reaction to crisis, but the careful assembly of annihilation. Ships were gathered from across the region, their holds filled not with trade goods, but with soldiers, weapons, and provisions for sustained operations. Dutch troops were reinforced by mercenaries and Asian auxiliaries, drawn from territories already under company influence. These men were not recruited for diplomacy or defense. They were assembled for enforcement through overwhelming force. Their presence signaled that Banda would be treated as a military objective, not a commercial partner. Supplies were calculated with precision. Food stocks, ammunition, and building materials were amassed to ensure that the expedition could maintain pressure without interruption. The VOC understood that hesitation created opportunities for resistance. The invasion would not rely on quick victories alone, but on endurance. Control would be achieved through attrition if necessary, starving opposition into submission if outright destruction proved insufficient. Fortifications already established on Banda were strengthened and prepared to serve as operational bases. From these positions, Dutch commanders could project power inland, cut off movement, and coordinate assaults across multiple islands. The landscape itself became part of the strategy. Narrow coastlines, steep hills, and limited escape routes were mapped and studied. What had once protected Bandanese autonomy through isolation now worked against them, turning the archipelago into a confined space where flight was difficult and concealment temporary. For the Bandanese, signs of impending catastrophe were unmistakable. Ships arrived in greater numbers and did not depart. Foreign soldiers unfamiliar with local customs appeared in camps along the shore. Patrols intensified, and contact with the outside world diminished further. The sea, already restricted, became a closed perimeter. Every horizon carried threat rather than opportunity. Fear reshaped daily life. Villages debated whether to resist, flee, or attempt last-minute accommodation. Some families hid food and tools in the interior, anticipating siege or destruction. Others sought escape to neighboring islands, knowing that pursuit was likely. These decisions were made under pressure, with incomplete information and no guarantee of survival. The weight of uncertainty bore heavily on communities already fractured by months of violence and reprisal. Within VOC ranks, preparation carried a different emotional register. Soldiers were briefed on the necessity of their mission. Banda was described as treacherous and lawless, its inhabitants incapable of obedience. Such framing was not incidental. It transformed killing into duty and erased doubt before it could take hold. Men accustomed to naval combat were conditioned to view civilians as obstacles rather than people, their presence an inconvenience to be resolved. Coen's orders emphasized speed and decisiveness. Prolonged resistance was to be avoided not out of mercy, but because it threatened efficiency. The goal was to break Banda's capacity to resist entirely, removing both leadership and population where necessary. The language of preparation reflected this intent. Plans focused not on negotiation points, but on routes of advance, targets, and methods of control. The Bandanese leadership faced an impossible calculus. Years of negotiation and limited resistance had led them here, to a moment when force loomed without pretense. Some leaders sought to rally defense, drawing on local knowledge of terrain and tactics. Others recognized the imbalance and argued for survival through submission or escape. The lack of unity, exacerbated by earlier treaties and reprisals, now proved fatal. No single strategy could command consensus or guarantee safety. As preparations reached their final stages, the psychological dimension of violence intensified. The presence of overwhelming force undermined morale before the first attack. The knowledge that annihilation was planned stripped resistance of its earlier confidence. Courage remained, but hope diminished. What people fought for shifted from victory to survival, from autonomy to endurance. The closing of Banda's world was nearly complete. Trade had ceased, allies had vanished, the sea was controlled by hostile ships. The interior offered only temporary refuge. The systems that had sustained life on the islands for generations were collapsing under the weight of impending invasion. Every delay deepened vulnerability, yet action carried its own dangers. From the VOC's perspective, the stage was set for resolution. Years of conflict, resistance, and frustration had culminated in a plan designed to end uncertainty permanently. The company was prepared to absorb the costs of violence in exchange for the stability of monopoly. Banda's fate was now a matter of execution rather than debate. As ships took their final positions and commanders awaited orders, the Banda Islands stood on the threshold of irreversible transformation. The preparations were complete. What remained was the act itself, when planning would give way to bloodshed and the abstract logic of monopoly would be enforced through physical destruction. The invasion, once a distant threat, was about to begin. The invasion of the Banda Islands in 1621 began without ceremony. There was no declaration, no final negotiation, no opportunity for retreat. Dutch ships moved into position with practiced efficiency, their presence closing the last openings in an already sealed sea. Soldiers disembarked in coordinated waves, landing on beaches that had once welcomed traders and now received armed men intent on domination. What followed was not a battle between equal forces, but the systematic application of violence against a population already weakened by isolation and fear. Villages nearest the shore were the first to be overrun. Dutch troops advanced with muskets and blades, supported by artillery fire from the ships offshore. Houses were set alight, food stores destroyed, and orchards damaged where they could be reached. These actions were not incidental. They were designed to deny sustenance and shelter, forcing survivors into the open or driving them inland where pursuit was easier. The destruction of nutmeg trees, the source of Banda's value, underscored the message that production would continue only under Dutch control. Bandanese resistance was immediate but fragmented. Small groups attempted to defend their villages or ambush advancing troops, using knowledge of terrain to strike quickly and withdraw. These efforts inflicted limited casualties, but could not halt the advance. The imbalance of arms and numbers was decisive. Each act of resistance provoked retaliation that fell not only on fighters, but on anyone nearby. Violence spread unevenly, leaving pockets of devastation separated by moments of fearful quiet. As Dutch forces pushed inland, the geography that had once offered refuge became a trap. Steep slopes and dense vegetation slowed movement, but offered little protection against determined pursuit. Families fled upward, carrying what they could, abandoning homes and harvests. Children and elders struggled to keep pace. The sound of gunfire and shouting echoed through the hills, breaking the familiar silence of the interior. Paths that had served daily travel became escape routes marked by panic. Capture brought little relief. Those taken alive were bound and forced to march, often without understanding their fate. Some were executed on the spot as examples. Others were held for interrogation, accused of resistance regardless of their involvement. The distinction between combatant and civilian collapsed entirely. Survival depended less on actions than on chance, on being overlooked or lost in the chaos of flight. The invasion unfolded across multiple islands, coordinated to prevent escape. Dutch commanders understood that Banda's strength lay in its interconnected communities and maritime mobility. By striking simultaneously and controlling the surrounding waters, they ensured that resistance could not consolidate or relocate. The sea, once Banda's lifeline, became an instrument of confinement, sealing the islands into a closed system of violence. For those hiding in the interior, hunger quickly became as lethal as weapons. With villages destroyed and food supplies burned or seized, survival grew uncertain. People foraged under constant threat of discovery, their movements constrained by patrols sweeping the hills. Night offered limited concealment, but no safety. Fires could not be lit without risking detection. Even water sources became dangerous, as soldiers monitored known paths and springs. Within the Dutch ranks, the invasion was framed as execution of duty. Orders were clear and unambiguous. Resistance was to be crushed decisively, not negotiated. Mercy was subordinate to efficiency. The speed and coordination of the assault reflected months of preparation and years of accumulated resolve. Banda was being remade through force, its existing society dismantled piece by piece. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The sudden collapse of familiar structures left survivors disoriented and terrified. Leadership disappeared through death or capture. Communication between communities broke down. Rumors of massacres spread faster than confirmation, amplifying fear and hastening flight. The sense of collective identity that had sustained Banda through earlier crises fractured under the strain of survival. Some Bandanese attempted to surrender, approaching Dutch positions with gestures of submission. These efforts were inconsistent in outcome. In some cases, surrender delayed death. In others, it led directly to execution. The lack of predictable response reinforced the understanding that there was no safe course of action. Compliance no longer guaranteed survival, and resistance invited destruction. Choice itself seemed to vanish. As the invasion continued, the scale of devastation expanded. Entire villages were emptied. The cultivated landscape that had supported Banda's population for generations was reduced to ash and silence. The nutmeg groves, spared only where future exploitation was planned, stood amid ruins that testified to the cost of control. The island's human geography was being erased even as their economic value was preserved. For the Bandanese, time collapsed into a continuous present of fear and flight. Days blurred together, marked by loss rather than routine. The future narrowed to immediate survival. Memories of open trade and autonomy receded, replaced by the reality of overwhelming force. What remained was endurance without expectation. By the end of the initial assaults, Banda was no longer a network of living communities, but a contested terrain under occupation. Resistance had not ended, but it had been broken into isolated, desperate acts. The invasion had achieved its immediate goal, the destruction of organized opposition and the collapse of social structures that might sustain it. Yet this was not the end. The violence that began with invasion now shifted toward consolidation. What followed would be more controlled, more deliberate, and in some ways more devastating. The Dutch had seized the islands, but possession alone was not enough. To secure monopoly, they would move next to eliminate Banda's people as a collective presence, transforming conquest into eradication. Captured Bandanese leaders faced a grim reality from the moment they were brought before Dutch officials. The VOC's definition of justice bore little resemblance to the customary processes of the islands, where Bandanese law emphasized restitution, negotiation, and mediation. Dutch authority operated on a principle that resistance itself constituted crime, punishable by death. Trials were formalities performed under the shadow of armed soldiers, designed less to establish guilt than to legitimize the eradication of autonomy. The accused, often bewildered by proceedings conducted in foreign languages and legal conventions, confronted a system that rendered their customary rights meaningless. Executions were carried out with deliberate visibility. Public gatherings were arranged to ensure that villagers witnessed the consequences of defiance. Leaders were hanged, beheaded, or shot, their deaths punctuating the landscape as warning. Soldiers were instructed to maintain order while simultaneously amplifying terror. The presence of muskets, cannons, and armed auxiliaries reinforced the impression that compliance was the only path to survival. Families of the executed were left to grapple with loss amid the chaos, often forced to witness their leaders' deaths without recourse. The systematic nature of these punishments transformed fear into an instrument of control. Each act of violence was a message to those who remained. Autonomy was intolerable, and negotiation was irrelevant. Communities fractured under the weight of threat. Where previously decisions had been debated and consensus sought, survival now demanded immediate action and constant vigilance. Parents guided children through hiding, while elders attempted to maintain knowledge of essential resources. The rhythm of daily life was replaced by a relentless calculation of risk and opportunity. Resistance, however, persisted even as terror spread. Small groups of villagers attacked isolated Dutch parties, seeking to disrupt supply lines or reclaim lost resources. These attacks were inevitably met with disproportionate reprisal. Entire villages could be razed for the actions of a few, and Dutch soldiers were instructed to punish collectively rather than individually. The boundaries between combatant and civilian were deliberately blurred, producing a climate in which survival itself became a form of defiance. Reports sent to Batavia painted the islands as irredeemably hostile, reinforcing Coen's belief that annihilation was necessary. Dutch correspondents emphasized the Bandanese as deceitful and violent, framing punitive measures as justifiable and proportionate. The reality on the ground, hunger, fear, dislocation, was compressed into bureaucratic language, abstracted from human experience, and used to validate further violence. The moral and psychological distance between policy and action widened as the company consolidated authority. Amid the executions, some leaders attempted to negotiate for survival, offering submission or cooperation. The VOC sometimes delayed immediate punishment for those who acquiesced, but this was tactical rather than merciful. Compliance did not guarantee protection, suspicion lingered, and Dutch officers were quick to interpret any deviation as defiance. Trust, once an essential component of Banda's social fabric, was impossible to restore. Each day under occupation reinforced the fragility of community ties and the omnipresence of danger. Survivors fled into the interior, seeking shelter in caves, dense forests, and hills. The Dutch pursued relentlessly, using knowledge of local terrain gathered from informants or captured inhabitants. The island's geography, once a shield, now became a cage. Escape was neither absolute nor safe. People who had relied on mobility for generations found routes blocked, hiding places compromised, and relief from hunger and fear limited. Life became a continuous negotiation between concealment and survival, a tense endurance under constant threat. Families were separated during raids, often permanently. Children, elders, and those too weak to flee were particularly vulnerable. The Dutch policy did not differentiate based on age or capacity. The goal was to break social cohesion and eradicate potential resistance. Communities, once bound by kinship, trade, and mutual reliance, were scattered or destroyed, their structures erased alongside the orchards and homes that had sustained them. By systematically removing leaders and fragmenting populations, the VOC ensured that any remaining resistance would be isolated and ineffectual. The islands, for the first time in centuries, were deprived not only of autonomy, but of the human networks that had maintained it. The psychological impact of these executions rippled outward, undermining morale, disrupting daily life, and signaling the scale of force that would be applied in subsequent operations. As the initial phase of punitive action concluded, Banda's human landscape was transformed. Villages lay in ruins, survivors hid or fled, and the framework of authority that had sustained society for generations was gone. Yet the Dutch had not finished. The island's depopulation was still underway. What had begun with visible trials and executions would soon escalate into systematic removal of the remaining population, ensuring that Banda's resistance could never coalesce again. The logic of terror, meticulously applied, had achieved its immediate objectives. Authority was unquestioned, resistance fragmented, and fear entrenched. But the human cost was staggering. Families destroyed, communities erased, and the psychological trauma of witnessing or surviving executions would reverberate for generations. Banda had moved decisively from a society negotiating survival under pressure to a landscape dominated by coercion, where the act of living itself had become precarious. The Dutch, confident in their monopoly and in the logic of punishment, prepared to move to the next stage. The first executions had demonstrated power, yet Banda's total subjugation required further measures. The islands had been humiliated, terrorized, and fragmented, but survival for anyone remaining was still possible. The next phase would eliminate that possibility entirely, ensuring that the VOC's control was absolute and permanent. By the time the Dutch began the systematic depopulation of the Banda Islands, survival had become a precarious calculation rather than a certainty. The executions and terror of the previous phase had fractured communities, leaving the remaining population scattered, fearful, and vulnerable. The islands that had once supported generations of Bandanese life were now battlegrounds where the physical landscape itself, hills, forests, and shores, was both refuge and trap. Escape by sea was increasingly impossible. The Dutch controlled the surrounding waters with patrolling ships that left no avenue of retreat unmonitored. Every movement carried risk, and every choice could be fatal. Dutch forces, acting under Jan Pieterszoon Coen's orders, moved methodically. Villages not yet destroyed were burned, crops were razed, and orchards stripped of their nutmeg. These actions were deliberate, calculated to deprive survivors of sustenance, forcing them into exposure, starvation, or surrender. Soldiers and mercenaries swept inland, targeting those who had evaded earlier assaults. Men, women, and children alike were caught in the systematic application of force. The distinction between combatant and non-combatant had long been erased. Survival was no longer determined by skill or courage alone, but by fortune and concealment. The Bandanese fled into forests and caves, carrying what they could: a child, a cooking pot, a small amount of food. The interior offered temporary concealment, but Dutch patrols adapted quickly. Guides familiar with the island's topography assisted soldiers in locating hiding places. Fires left for cooking or warmth became beacons for pursuers. Hunger compounded fear, as the destruction of staple crops and orchards left little to forage. Families weakened by exposure and exhaustion fell behind, often never to rejoin the group. Captures were frequent and public. Those apprehended were bound, marched to fortifications along the coast, and executed or deported. The Dutch maintained visibility of these actions to ensure that even those remaining in hiding understood the consequences of continued resistance. Every act of survival was rendered impossible without risk, creating a climate of total submission. The island's population, once resilient and adaptable, faced attrition not through battle alone, but through starvation, exposure, and psychological terror. Coen's plan extended beyond immediate extermination. Survivors, especially those captured alive, were shipped to Batavia and other Dutch holdings, where they were enslaved or used as labor to support VOC operations elsewhere. This removal was strategic as well as punitive. It eliminated the possibility of local resurgence and reinforced the company AS control over the region. By transplanting populations, the VOC severed connections to ancestral lands, disrupting social structures that had endured for centuries. The depopulation of Banda was not a single, instantaneous act, but a sustained campaign. Over weeks and months, Dutch forces systematically eliminated resistance, tracked escapees, and destroyed infrastructure. Homes, storage facilities, and religious structures were demolished. Nutmeg groves, unless earmarked for future exploitation under Dutch supervision, were cut down or burned to prevent any return to autonomy. Every action was designed to secure the islands not only for profit, but for permanent control. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound. People who had hidden, fled, or watched loved ones executed now faced the erosion of identity, community, and culture. Children grew up amid loss and terror, learning survival in the shadows rather than life in an open, connected society. Elders bore witness to the destruction of ancestral homes and sacred spaces, carrying trauma that would outlast their own lifetimes. The island's human geography, the relationships, networks, and traditions that had sustained Bandanese life, was effectively erased. Dutch soldiers and administrators viewed the depopulation as efficient governance rather than atrocity. Reports to Batavia emphasized success. The islands were cleared, the monopoly secured, and the threat of resistance neutralized. Letters and documents framed violence as restoration of order, obscuring the scale of human suffering that had enabled the company's economic triumph. In bureaucratic terms, Banda was now productive, controlled, and compliant. In human terms, it was emptied, scarred, and irrevocably transformed. Survivors who remained in hiding faced impossible choices. Some attempted to escape to neighboring islands, only to encounter patrols or inhospitable environments. Others surrendered under duress, accepting enslavement or forced relocation in exchange for life. Resistance had become survival, and survival demanded decisions that would forever alter individual lives and family trajectories. Every day brought new calculations of risk, exposure, and endurance. By the conclusion of the depopulation, Banda's population had been reduced dramatically. Entire communities were annihilated or removed. The islands that had once been vibrant centers of trade, culture, and governance were now dominated entirely by the Dutch East India Company, a landscape transformed by violence into a commodity-producing space. The human presence that had shaped Banda for centuries was diminished almost entirely, leaving the nutmeg groves as the only enduring testament to the island's prior prosperity. The depopulation marked a turning point not only in Banda AS history, but in the broader pattern of VOC operations. The islands were now a model of how commerce, state authority, and violence could intersect to secure monopoly. What had begun as negotiation and trade had become extermination, demonstrating the extreme lengths to which the company would go to enforce control. Banda, once a society negotiating survival, had become a space where survival itself was threatened systematically, and human life subordinated entirely to profit and authority. The stage was set for the next phase, rebuilding the islands not for the Bandanese but for plantation exploitation. Dutch planters would arrive, enslaved labor would be imported, and the island's society would be refashioned entirely in service of the spice trade. Banda's human geography was gone, and what remained would be a landscape of profit, labor, and domination. The Banda Islands, once a network of villages, groves, and maritime connections, were now emptied of most of their original inhabitants. The Dutch East India Company, having removed resistance through executions, terror, and forced deportation, turned its attention to the task of making the islands productive under its direct control. What had been a society organized around community, negotiation, and seasonal trade would be transformed into a plantation system in which human labor was extracted and controlled to serve the monopoly rather than the needs of the people who had lived there for generations. Dutch planters, known as perkeniers, arrived to oversee the remaining nutmeg groves. These men, often middle-class merchants or company employees seeking opportunity, were granted plots of land and the responsibility to manage production. Their authority derived from the VOC rather than local custom, and it rested on the control of labor rather than negotiation. The land that had once been collectively managed by families and village leaders was now parceled, fenced, and subordinated to a profit-driven hierarchy, its value measured not in human well-being, but in yield and export. Labor was imported to replace the depopulated Bandanese population. Slaves were brought from other islands in the East Indies, including Java, Sulawesi, and elsewhere under VOC influence. They were pressed into service, uprooted from their own communities, and thrust into an environment shaped by violence, fear, and unfamiliar customs. Their lives were regimented by the demands of spice production, and any attempt to resist or escape was met with harsh punishment. In this system, survival required obedience, endurance, and constant adaptation to unfamiliar authority. The imported laborers quickly became enmeshed in a landscape transformed by the Dutch presence. Nutmeg trees were cultivated intensively, orchards replanted and expanded, and the island's terrain reshaped to facilitate extraction. Terraces were cut into hillsides, irrigation and transport routes imposed, and groves maintained under the supervision of perkeniers and armed overseers. The land itself became an instrument of control, each slope and channel designed to maximize yield and minimize the possibility of rebellion. For the survivors of the original Bandanese population, life under this new system was precarious. Those who remained were often reduced to servitude within their own homeland, stripped of autonomy and authority. Knowledge of the land, once a source of power and security, was repurposed by the Dutch to increase efficiency and productivity. Cultural practices and governance structures that had sustained Banda for centuries were systematically dismantled or rendered irrelevant. Human relationships that had once defined community were subordinated to labor schedules, rules, and surveillance. The transformation of Banda was also social. Dutch planters lived in isolated compounds, separated from the enslaved laborers by both physical structures and social hierarchy. Communication across these divides was limited to orders and supervision, reinforcing separation and minimizing collaboration. The island's maritime connections, which had previously enabled trade and social networks, were now controlled entirely by the VOC. Ships arrived and departed on company schedules, carrying nutmeg to distant markets, while movement of people within the islands was restricted. The sea, once a highway of exchange, had become a boundary of containment. Violence persisted as a tool of governance. Enslaved laborers were disciplined through physical punishment. Escapes were pursued rigorously, and attempts at collective resistance were swiftly crushed. Authority was enforced continuously, leaving little space for negotiation or self-determination. Every act of compliance was secured through the threat of reprisal, and every moment of survival required careful calculation. The island's population was diminished and controlled not only by numbers, but by fear, transforming Banda into a managed landscape of productivity and domination. Economically, the system succeeded according to VOC measures. Nutmeg, the commodity that had made Banda so valuable, flowed reliably into Batavia and then to Europe. The monopoly was enforced more effectively than any treaty or negotiation could have accomplished, and profit was extracted with unprecedented certainty. Yet this success came at the cost of human life, autonomy, and cultural continuity. The islands no longer existed as a society. They existed as a resource, organized entirely around extraction. The human experience under this transformation was one of continuous adaptation to oppression. Survivors navigated a world where every interaction was structured by hierarchy and surveillance. Knowledge that had once ensured survival, where to find food, how to navigate the sea, how to mediate disputes, was now repurposed or irrelevant. Social structures had been stripped away, leaving individuals and families to endure under the imposition of foreign authority. By reshaping Banda through imported labor and the Perkinier system, the Dutch created a model for plantation economy that would be repeated elsewhere in the East Indies. The islands became an example of how corporate authority could replace society with production, and how the human cost of monopoly could be rendered invisible in pursuit of profit. What had once been a thriving, independent, and socially complex archipelago was now reduced to a controlled, labor-driven landscape, a space in which survival was subordinated entirely to the logic of commerce. The transformation of Banda was both complete and absolute. From the perspective of the Dutch East India Company, the islands now functioned exactly as intended. Nutmeg was produced efficiently, resistance was eliminated, and profit flowed reliably. From the perspective of the human beings who had inhabited the islands for generations, the result was a profound loss of home, of autonomy, and of the possibility of self-determination. Banda was no longer a place of negotiation, culture, and life. It was a plantation, a site of domination, and a monument to the intersection of violence and commerce. The island's future was secured in productivity, but the echoes of what had been lost, communities, knowledge, and autonomy, remained embedded in the landscape and in the memories of those few who survived. The next episodes would trace the continuation of the VOC system, the human cost it exacted, and the long-term implications of Banda's transformation on global trade and memory. Under the Dutch East India Company's control, The Banda Islands became a landscape defined by the extraction of nutmeg rather than the rhythms of life that had sustained their inhabitants for centuries. The orchards, once maintained collectively and tended according to local knowledge and seasonal patterns, were now subject to rigid schedules, overseen by perkineers and armed overseers. Trees were pruned and harvested with efficiency in mind, their productivity measured meticulously in the VOC's ledgers. Every branch, every fruit, became a symbol of the company's authority, a commodity whose value eclipsed the people who once nurtured it. Ships arrived regularly, their holds emptied of nutmeg and replenished with provisions and reinforcements. The sea, which had previously connected Banda to a network of traders and communities across the archipelago, was now a controlled highway, patrolled and monitored to ensure that no produce left the islands except under VOC sanction. Every vessel departing for Batavia carried not only spice, but the imprint of violence and displacement that had made its production possible. For the few Bandanese who survived, the ocean became a boundary rather than a lifeline, a constant reminder that autonomy had been erased. The imported laborers, drawn from Java, Sulawesi, and other Dutch holdings, worked under strict supervision. Punishment for failure or perceived defiance was swift, reinforcing a culture of fear. Life was reduced to cycles of planting, harvesting, and maintenance, punctuated by surveillance and coercion. Survival required endurance, compliance, and the capacity to navigate the unrelenting pressures of occupation. Skills that had once allowed communities to thrive, knowledge of soil, water, and local weather, were now applied within constraints imposed by foreign masters, stripped of social or cultural context. The human experience of this new Banda was one of isolation and control. Families lived separated, communication monitored, and movement restricted. Social bonds, once vital for negotiation, trade, and collective defense, were subordinated to productivity. Children grew up learning labor rather than community, observing obedience rather than autonomy. The memory of the island's former society persisted only faintly, passed in whispered stories or fragments of tradition. For the Dutch, the system was a triumph of administration. Ledgers recorded output, cargo manifests tracked shipments, and profits flowed reliably to Batavia and onward to Europe. The islands functioned as a model of corporate imperialism, human life organized around production, social structures reshaped to ensure compliance, and the landscape itself converted into an instrument of extraction. Reports from planters and VOC officials emphasized efficiency and stability, portraying the islands as secure and productive, a testament to the power of monopoly enforced by violence and surveillance. Yet, beneath the surface of these reports lay the cost invisible to those far from the islands. The population that had once animated Banda, its leaders, traders, and families, was almost entirely gone. Communities had been fractured, displaced, or destroyed. Knowledge of local customs and ecology survived only in fragments, held by a few laborers or in memories that could not shape governance. The rhythms of daily life that had once defined the islands were replaced by regimens designed solely for production and profit. Even the landscape bore witness to the transformation. Nutmeg groves, though productive, were maintained through intensive labor rather than communal care. Hillsides were reshaped for accessibility, irrigation channels carved to serve efficiency rather than ecological balance. Buildings constructed by the Dutch replaced traditional homes, forts, and guard posts punctuated the shorelines, and paths once used for trade and communication now served as patrol routes or transport corridors. The environment itself reflected the imposition of authority, its contours reordered to support the monopoly. Resistance persisted in small, hidden ways. Laborers sometimes sabotaged tools, hid seeds, or delayed work, subtle acts that carried risk but allowed the assertion of agency within a system designed to erase it. Such defiance, though minimal in scope, demonstrated that even under total control, human ingenuity and the desire for autonomy could not be extinguished entirely. The VOC's reports rarely recorded these acts, and when they did, they interpreted them as criminality rather than survival or protest. The contrast between the island's productivity and the absence of their original people created a paradox. Banda was profitable and stable in economic terms, yet its human and cultural life had been devastated. Success was measured in cargo holds and profits, not in communities, continuity, or social cohesion. The landscape produced wealth, but the human cost of that wealth was permanent and visible only in absence, silence, and the fragmented lives of survivors. The flow of nutmeg under Dutch control symbolized the triumph of the VOC's vision of monopoly. Every shipment reinforced global dependence on Dutch spice. Every ledger confirmed the power of corporate authority backed by coercion. Yet the islands themselves were hollowed, their former vibrancy replaced by the mechanisms of production and oversight. The human presence that had given Banda its character was largely gone, leaving only a managed population whose existence was dictated entirely by the requirements of the company. In this phase, Banda had ceased to be a society and become a tool. Its forests, groves, and shores were organized for output. Its remaining people were organized for labor. The island's past, the complex interplay of trade, negotiation, and culture, persisted only in memory, fragmentary and shadowed by violence. The legacy of Banda's transformation extended beyond the archipelago itself, shaping patterns of corporate control, colonial governance, and human displacement throughout the East Indies. By the end of this period, the islands were economically successful, politically secure for the Dutch, and socially devastated. The VOC had achieved its objective, but the human cost was extraordinary. The few who survived understood, through observation and lived experience, that Banda's transformation had erased not only autonomy, but also the possibility of returning to the way of life that had once defined the islands. The next episodes would explore global implications, historical memory, and the enduring shadow of Banda on trade, empire, and human societies. The Banda Islands, though small in scale, quickly assumed significance far beyond their shores. The VOC's success in transforming Banda from an independent, self-governing society into a tightly controlled plantation system reverberated across Asia and Europe. For the Dutch, Banda became more than a source of nutmeg. It was a demonstration of the power of monopoly backed by force, a model of how commerce could be enforced through the coordination of state and company. The lessons learned in Banda would guide operations across the archipelago, reshaping patterns of trade, governance, and human control for decades to come. The capture and depopulation of Banda offered a template for the suppression of resistance elsewhere. VOC officials observed that fear, strategic violence, and the removal of local leadership could secure compliance more reliably than negotiation or treaty. Islands with autonomous communities, previously capable of conducting trade on their own terms, were now evaluated through a lens of control. Authority, when enforced decisively and without compromise, could ensure predictability of production and the safeguarding of monopoly profits. Banda's experience became a case study in corporate imperialism, the integration of violence, logistics, and governance to maximize economic return. Globally, Banda's nutmeg flowed into the expanding networks of European trade, demonstrating the reach and efficiency of the Dutch East India Company. Ships departed Batavia for ports in Holland, England, and beyond, carrying a commodity that commanded exorbitant prices in European markets. The economic impact was immediate and transformative. Banda's nutmeg fueled speculation, encouraged investment in VOC operations, and reinforced the company's position as a dominant global actor. The island's production, extracted through displacement and coercion, became a linchpin of international commerce, highlighting the intersection of local violence and global profit. The Banda example also influenced Dutch strategy in other spice-producing regions. Java, Ambon, and the Moluccas were brought under similar systems of monopoly, surveillance, and coercion. The principles applied in Banda, removal of uncooperative populations, introduction of controlled labor, and regimented oversight of production, were adapted to fit diverse geographic and social contexts. The human consequences, though varying in scale, were comparable: disruption of traditional governance, loss of autonomy, and the subordination of local populations to economic objectives defined far from their homelands. European observers received reports of Banda with a mixture of admiration and detachment. VOC correspondents emphasized efficiency, order, and profitability, while largely omitting the scale of human suffering. In Batavia and Amsterdam, Banda was described as a successful conquest of both land and society, a proof of Dutch ingenuity and resolve. The islands became a symbol of what could be achieved when corporate ambition was fused with military capability, demonstrating that control over people could be as valuable as control over commodities. For the surviving Bandanese and displaced populations, however, Banda's global significance carried little comfort. The islands had been emptied, their social fabric dismantled, and their autonomy erased. The global trade they now fueled was built upon the absence of their agency, their traditions, and their communities. Families were scattered, cultural practices disrupted, and knowledge of the land repurposed for foreign profit. The human cost of Banda's integration into global commerce was invisible in European ledgers, yet immediate, lived, and enduring for those who survived. The Banda conquest also sent a message to neighboring regions. Autonomy, resistance, and negotiation could be met with overwhelming force. Local rulers observed that the Dutch were willing to destroy entire communities to enforce monopoly, and the lesson shaped diplomatic and commercial behavior across the East Indies. Fear became a tool of empire as effective as any treaty or contract. The psychological impact extended far beyond the islands themselves, influencing patterns of compliance and shaping relationships between European powers and indigenous societies. In economic terms, the VOC leveraged Banda to secure not only production, but reputation. The successful enforcement of monopoly reinforced investor confidence, justified expansion, and encouraged replication of coercive practices elsewhere. The islands became a benchmark: production without resistance, profit without negotiation, and compliance enforced through the combination of state-backed violence and corporate authority. Banda demonstrated that the integration of governance, military power, and commerce could produce wealth at a scale previously unattainable in Asia. Yet beneath the economic triumph lay the enduring imprint of loss. Banda's transformation erased centuries of history, memory, and social structure. Its people were removed, scattered, or subordinated to labor in their own homeland. What remained was a human landscape shaped by fear and subjugation, a society subordinated to the imperatives of global trade. The islands' integration into global networks of profit was inseparable from the violence and displacement that made it possible. Banda's story, when traced across the wider Dutch Empire, illuminates a fundamental truth of the VOC's operations. The production of commodities on a global scale was inseparable from the application of coercive authority. Where negotiation failed, violence succeeded. Where populations resisted, they were removed. Where profit demanded certainty, human life was subordinated. Banda became a proof of principle, a blueprint for empire, and a stark illustration of how global commerce could be engineered through the orchestration of fear, labor, and territorial control. By the end of this phase, Banda was no longer merely a local tragedy, but a node in the global system of Dutch trade and authority. Its significance extended far beyond its shores, shaping policies, perceptions, and the expansion of corporate power across Asia. Yet the islands themselves remained marked by absence. The communities that had made them vibrant were gone, and what survived was a world reorganized for the extraction of value rather than the sustenance of life. Even as Banda as Nutmeg flowed across oceans and filled the coffers of the Dutch East India Company, the story of what had occurred on the islands was quietly reshaped, rewritten, and, in many ways, erased. European accounts rarely lingered on the human cost of conquest, portraying the islands instead as a triumph of enterprise and order. Reports describe compliance secured, production stabilized, and trade monopolized, framing Banda as a success story rather than a site of devastation. The violence, displacement, and terror that had emptied the islands were compressed into footnotes or obscured entirely, leaving a narrative in which the islands themselves seemed passive, obedient, and almost functional in their absence. In the archives of Batavia and Amsterdam, Banda was reduced to ledger entries, shipment manifests, and correspondence emphasizing efficiency. Letters from VOC officials praised the Perkiniers' management of nutmeg orchards and recorded output with meticulous care, transforming human lives into numerical data. Survivors, scattered across the East Indies or enslaved on other islands, were rarely mentioned, their experiences deemed irrelevant to the accounting of success. In this way, Banda's memory in European eyes became a landscape of commodity rather than a society of people. Maps and charts contributed to this abstraction. Cartographers recorded the islands with precision, marking groves, harbors, and fortifications, yet omitting the villages, families, and networks that had previously sustained life there. Banda's human geography, once a complex web of trade routes, kinship, and social connections, was rendered invisible. The islands were represented as a productive space, defined by orchards and coastline, with little reference to the lives that had been lost or the cultural structures that had been destroyed. Stories told by merchants, sailors, and officials reinforced this sanitized image. Anecdotes focused on the difficulty of harvesting nutmeg, the challenges of navigating ships, or the efficiency of plantation management. Rare references to conflict emphasized Dutch resolve rather than Bandanese suffering. The narrative framed the conquest as inevitable, the displacement as regrettable but necessary, and the island's previous autonomy as an obstacle overcome by superior strategy and enterprise. Violence was abstracted, rendered a tool rather than a human experience. Local memory, however, persisted in fragments. Survivors and descendants carried stories of loss, displacement, and resilience whispered across generations. These accounts rarely entered written records. They existed in oral histories, small acts of remembrance, and subtle resistance to the erasure of identity. Families recalled leaders executed, villages destroyed, and children hidden or taken away. The island's cultural continuity was fractured, yet memory remained embedded in the few who had survived the systematic destruction and in the scattered diaspora of Bandanese people across the region. The contrast between European myth and local memory illustrates the duality of Banda's legacy. In one version, the islands were productive, compliant, and economically successful. In the other, they were sites of trauma, displacement, and cultural obliteration. The absence of Bandanese voices in written accounts allowed the narrative of Dutch triumph to dominate history, reinforcing a perception of inevitability, progress, and efficiency while concealing the lived reality of terror and loss. This erasure was not accidental. VOC officials understood that controlling narrative reinforced control of territory. By portraying Banda as compliant and productive, the company legitimized its monopoly and justified the methods used to achieve it. The islands became an example of how history could be constructed to validate power, where absence was transformed into success and human cost was omitted from the story of enterprise. Even in Europe, Banda became legendary more for its commodity than its people. Nutmeg, transported in barrels, sold at high prices, and incorporated into markets across the continent, carried the imprint of violence only faintly perceived. The islands were romanticized in some accounts as exotic, fertile, and profitable, while the realities of conquest, depopulation, and forced labor were largely ignored. Banda became a symbol of economic opportunity rather than human catastrophe. The process of myth-making also influenced later historiography. Scholars and chroniclers who relied on VOC records inherited this skewed perspective. Treaties, shipment logs, and administrative correspondence were interpreted as evidence of lawful governance and organized production, rather than coercion and displacement. The Bandanese experience, though devastating and enduring, was marginalized in favor of narratives that celebrated monopoly, control, and European ingenuity. Yet, beneath the layers of abstraction and myth, traces of reality endured. The scars of violence were etched into the landscape. Abandoned villages, overgrown paths, and disrupted social networks. Stories whispered by survivors preserved knowledge of what had been lost. Cultural practices adapted, fragmented, and sometimes survived, testifying to resilience even amid erasure. Memory persisted in ways that could not be fully suppressed, standing in tension with the official record that sought to redefine Banda as a productive, compliant, and largely empty space. By the end of this phase, the dual legacy of Banda was clear. To the VOC and to European observers, it was a triumph of control, order, and profit. To the Bandanese and their descendants, it was a site of devastation, displacement, and cultural disruption. The islands existed simultaneously as commodity and as human tragedy, as myth and memory intertwined, their story mediated by who recorded it, who survived, and who was silenced. The human legacy of the Banda Islands unfolded slowly, measured not in years or seasons, but in the persistence of absence and the endurance of memory. Generations who survived the depopulation and forced labor carried the weight of the island's transformation with them, a burden woven into family histories, personal identity, and collective memory. The islands that had once been home, that had sustained communities through trade, governance, and ritual, now existed as spaces defined by domination, surveillance, and extraction. Life continued, but its contours were forever altered, shaped by the violence of the past and the structures imposed by the Dutch East India Company. Demographically, Banda was unrecognizable. The original Bandanese population, decimated by executions, deportation, and flight, had been replaced with imported laborers from Java, Sulawesi, and other islands under VOC influence. These men and women were pressed into service with little regard for kinship, culture, or community cohesion. Families were separated, elders marginalized, and children born into labor rather than autonomy. While the islands retained human presence, it was a population shaped entirely by the demands of productivity and control rather than the rhythms of traditional life. The cultural fabric of Banda, once rich with rituals, social structures, and local governance, was effectively destroyed. Religious practices, leadership hierarchies, and communal institutions that had sustained social cohesion for centuries were fragmented or erased. Survivors and descendants carried fragments of memory, preserving language, stories, and customs in whispers or isolated practices, yet these could not restore the society that had existed. Knowledge of the land, of cultivation, and of trade persisted in practical forms, but stripped of its original context and social meaning. Life for the remaining Bandanese under the Perkinier system was one of constant adaptation. Labor and survival were inseparable, and every day was structured by the imperatives of the VOC. Tasks previously coordinated communally or guided by local expertise were now dictated by foreign supervisors and enforced with threats or punishment. Endurance, obedience, and resourcefulness replaced negotiation, community decision-making, and social reciprocity as the core competencies of life. Cultural transmission was constrained, learning focused on survival rather than heritage. Even amid these conditions, resilience endured. Some survivors preserved knowledge of nutmeg cultivation, maritime routes, and forested landscapes, ensuring that the island's ecology could continue to sustain production. Others maintained social bonds in secret, creating networks of mutual support under the watchful eyes of the Dutch. Small acts of cultural persistence, songs, rituals, or oral histories allowed fragments of identity to survive despite the systematic effort to erase them. These traces of continuity, though fragile, demonstrated the capacity of human societies to endure even when formal structures are destroyed. The introduction of imported labor created new social dynamics. People from different islands, speaking different languages and practicing distinct customs, were thrust together under harsh conditions. Communication, trust, and community had to be reconstructed from scratch. The resulting hybrid population reflected both the violence of displacement and the human need for connection. Social hierarchies emerged based on proximity to power, perceived reliability, and labor skills, yet these were artificial, imposed by circumstance rather than organic development. Economically, Banda remained a linchpin of the VOC's spice trade, yet the human cost continued to be immense. Every shipment of nutmeg carried the imprint of displacement, fear, and labor enforced by coercion. The island's transformation allowed the Dutch to consolidate global monopoly, but the human and cultural costs remained embedded in the population, the landscape, and the memories of survivors. Production continued, but the society that had enabled it centuries earlier was gone, leaving only managed labor and the physical presence of the islands. Long-term consequences extended beyond Banda itself. The disruption of local populations, the introduction of enslaved labor, and the imposition of Dutch authority influenced surrounding regions, creating patterns of control and extraction that would be repeated elsewhere in the East Indies. Banda became both a cautionary tale and a blueprint, demonstrating the consequences of resistance to corporate and imperial power. Its story was transmitted indirectly through both observation and example, shaping the strategies of both colonizers and indigenous populations across the archipelago. For descendants of the original Bandanese, the island's transformation remained a source of historical memory and identity. Stories of loss, survival, and resilience were passed through generations, often in fragmented or symbolic forms. These narratives preserved knowledge of the pre-VOC society, the violence of conquest, and the mechanisms of control that followed, ensuring that the human consequences of Banda's transformation were neither forgotten nor abstracted into purely economic terms. By this stage, Banda existed in multiple temporalities simultaneously, as a site of labor and production under Dutch control, as a symbol of global economic power, and as a repository of cultural trauma and memory. The island's present and future were inseparable from the events of conquest and depopulation, and every human experience on the islands was framed by the intersection of survival, memory, and imposed authority. The story of Banda's demographic and cultural legacy underscores the human consequences of corporate and colonial ambition. The islands were not simply a site of trade. They were a space in which human life was subordinated to profit, where social structures were replaced by enforced labor hierarchies, and where survival became a practice of adaptation and endurance. The next episode would examine the final reflections, the broader lessons of Banda, its enduring imprint on trade, empire, and human societies, and the ways in which these islands shaped both history and memory.